Welcome. On August 14th, 1861, just over 4 months after the Civil War began, abolitionist and social reformer Sarah Blake Sturgis Shaw wrote a letter to Frederick Law Olmsted, the co-designer of Central Park in New York City. Referencing both the war and his professional work, she wrote, "If we can remake the government, abolish slavery, and get the Central Park well underway for our descendants, we shall have done a work worthy of the 19th century." From the vantage point of the present, the first two obviously go together. But why did she consider Central Park the other great work for 19th century Americans to undertake? It's a big story that ranges across the development of American culture, both artistically and politically. So today, we'll look at the history of public parks in the United States and come to better understand why many have described national parks as America's best idea. Before we go any further, we need to back up a bit. In the mid-19th century, the United States was a very young country. In fact, still today, when compared with countries in such places as Europe or Asia, the United States is still quite young. If you live in the United States but want to see deeper expressions of human history and culture, you have to go elsewhere. But this isn't a new recognition. In truth, in the immediate wake of the American Revolution, any number of well-traveled Americans recognized this fact. Given the cultural background of the United States, their most immediate point of reference for witnessing older history was Europe. And many in Europe recognized this, deriding American culture as shallow and inferior. For example, in 1820, the British author Sydney Smith asked, "In the four quarters of the globe, who reads an American book, or goes to an American play, or looks at an American picture or statue?" And many Americans feared that he was right. In fact, many shared Smith's view through at least the mid-19th century. Consider James Fenimore Cooper, who is best known as the author of The Last of the Mohicans, as he wrote in 1852 in an essay entitled American and European Scenery Compared. As a whole, it must be admitted that Europe offers to the senses sublimer views, and certainly grander, than are to be found within our own borders, unless we resort to the Rocky Mountains and the ranges of California and New Mexico. You might say that, culturally, the United States literally lacked historical markers, and therefore a historical identity. And, in the concluding paragraph of his essay, Cooper continued, "We concede to Europe the noblest scenery, while we claim for America the freshness of a most promising youth, and a species of natural radiance that carries the mind with reverence to the source of all that is glorious around us." Praising America's youth was perhaps a backhanded compliment, but Cooper's words also point to something else. Considering natural wonders as a sign of antiquity. A natural antiquity, so to speak, but antiquity nonetheless, and therefore the kind of history that Americans otherwise lacked at the cultural level. And in fact, it was the American landscape that inspired the first great American artistic movement, that is, the Hudson River School. Now, despite its name, it was not an educational institution. Rather, think of school in the sense of a movement. The Hudson River School was named after the Hudson River in New York, and its first great painter was Thomas Cole. Cole's first great painting is here. Generally known as the Oxbow, its full title is View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm. The painting portrays the Connecticut River Valley, appropriately enough, after a thunderstorm, and it was unveiled to the public in 1836. The word oxbow is a technical term denoting a U-shaped bend in a river. With Cole's work, landscape painting became one of the dominant subjects in both American painting and American photography for several decades, and this included the crucial years following the Civil War. Most influential upon the development of national parks were paintings and photographs of Yosemite Valley. Consider this painting by Albert Bierstadt, one of the greatest painters of the Hudson River School. And he went on to paint even more scenes from Yosemite Valley. So too, consider this photograph by Carleton Watkins. In 1861, Watkins took his first trip to Yosemite Valley. And, like Bierstadt, the valley was among the main subjects of his art. And this brings us directly back to the topic of parks. Despite the concern for antiquities, many Americans were ambivalent about various cultural and governmental practices in Europe. In fact, they often called Europe the Old World, and this belief in the inferiority of the so-called Old World influenced American politics in a variety of ways. Frederick Law Olmsted's work on Central Park was partially driven by his desire to alleviate various effects of inequality in the United States. From Olmsted's perspective, such inequality was unbecoming a republic such as the United States because inequality belonged to the Old World, that is, the European world. Having traveled widely in Europe, he observed that parks and gardens, together with the rest and relaxation provided through such environments, were the preserve of the wealthy. A public park was a park for the public and a new idea. As Olmsted said about Central Park, "It is one of the great purposes of the park to supply to the hundreds of thousands of tired workers who have no opportunity to spend their summers in the country, a specimen of God's handiwork that shall be to them inexpensively what a month or two in the White Mountains or the Adirondacks is at great cost to those in easier circumstances." Begun before the Civil War and finished after, Olmsted was among those who saw Central Park as a literal symbol of the durability of the American Union. And, as the first American public park, Central Park soon inspired imitations elsewhere. Central Park wasn't the only public park whose history was soon connected to that of the Civil War, nor was it the only public park soon connected to Frederick Law Olmsted. In 1863, Olmsted arrived in San Francisco to take a new job. While living there, it was proposed that Yosemite Valley be set aside as a public park. Given Olmsted's work on Central Park, and given that he now lived in the area, he was asked to write a report about Yosemite Valley. And so much of what we've already talked about features in Olmsted's report. He began by writing about art in the United States, contrasting it with the Civil War. It is a fact of much significance, with reference to the temper and spirit which ruled the loyal people of the United States during the War of the Great Rebellion, that livelier susceptibility to the influence of art was apparent. Olmsted explicitly credited the paintings of Albert Bierstadt and the photography of Carleton Watkins for inspiring others to preserve the valley as a public park. But Olmsted also compared the valley with the gardens and parks of Europe, which he called the Old World. He argued that, as a public park, Yosemite Valley would benefit all classes of Americans. In this, Olmsted tied the New World to two different ideals. One idea was that of the Republic, a political space defined by citizenship and participation rather than hierarchy. In this, the same moral convictions that animated his work on Central Park now took root in a much larger public space in California. The other ideal was that of strengthening the federal authority of the United States government. Olmsted doesn't discuss this in his report, but in the wake of the Civil War, he was explicit in his suspicion of arguments for states' rights. It is a simple fact that the creation of federal parks was yet another way of strengthening federal authority. When Sarah Sturgis wrote to Olmsted about the need to remake the government, she probably didn't think that public parks would be part of that. But with the development of national parks, the ideal of the public park became an important element in the remaking of the American government after the Civil War. People like Sarah Shaw and Frederick Law Olmsted connected American parks with the American people, and therefore with American democracy. And others took this idea forward. Leaping ahead a few decades, President Theodore Roosevelt was an eloquent advocate of this ideal. In 1903, he helped lay the cornerstone of the gateway to Yellowstone National Park. He then said a few words in which he also joined together environmental preservation to American democracy. The creation and preservation of such a great natural playground in the interest of our people as a whole is a credit to the nation. The scheme of its preservation is noteworthy in its essential democracy. He then explained that the park existed not just for the rich, but for all American people, both the living and those yet to be born. Here, all the wild creatures of the old days are being preserved, and their overflow into the surrounding country means that the people of the surrounding country, so long as they see that the laws are observed by all, will be able to ensure to themselves and to their children and to their children's children much of the old-time pleasure of the hardy life of the wilderness and of the hunter in the wilderness. So what? In the United States today, there are many kinds of parks. The most famous might be national, but there are state parks as well as municipal parks. What we call these parks depends upon the governing authority. Cities oversee municipal parks. State governments oversee state parks. And, quite obviously, the federal government, through the National Park Service, oversees national parks. Not all parks focus on environmental preservation. Municipal parks, especially when set up for families with small children, are more oriented toward the democratic. Funded by taxpayer dollars, they rarely, if ever, charge anything like an entrance fee. But state, and especially federal parks, usually do charge entrance fees and are more often concerned with environmental preservation. But both conservation and democracy draw upon the conviction that the living owe something to future generations, and that this is best maintained by ensuring, in the words of President Roosevelt, that the laws are observed by all. It's no exaggeration to say that environmental conservation has often been seen as an important element of American belief in democracy. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First, for a historical survey of the full sweep of America's national parks, read National Parks: The American Experience by Alfred Runte. It's a popular work and has gone through multiple editions. Beginning with the United States after the American Revolution, Runte follows the story into the 21st century. To learn more about Frederick Law Olmsted and his abiding influence, read Olmsted and Yosemite: Civil War, Abolition, and the National Park Idea by Rolf Diamant and Ethan Carr. It's an engaging overview of how political ideas intersected landscape architecture, and it contains a complete transcription of Olmsted's famous Yosemite report. Finally, President Roosevelt's short speech at Yellowstone is gathered together with various of his other political and environmental writings in selected speeches and writings of Theodore Roosevelt, edited by Gordon Hunter. It shows why Roosevelt was such a force in his own lifetime and why he is still seen as one of our greatest presidents. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.